about personality here, part one, Freud and psychoanalysis. Here we go. Conscious thoughts, and this is what we want to believe. Unconscious, we have these thoughts and desires that aren't really acceptable in reality, and so we kind of repress them a bit and we keep them unconscious to where we don't know. And he says those unconscious things, those things that we don't see, which are usually sexual, or when we're talking about Freud, he says they usually have to do with sex. They motivate us to do what we to for our actions. So that's the underlying motivation for basically everything I do is our unconscious, and that's what psychoanalysis studies. Okay, um, what modern psychologists today, who's unconscious, right? We've talked about this before. It's just what we're unaware of, this information processing that's going on in our brain all the time that we're unaware of. So Freud's unconscious is a lot different than modern unconscious. And one thing to get out of the way real quick is that Freud today, there's no psychologists and there's no schools of psychology who practice Freudian psychology. Um, you read about it and you hear about it and you learn about it in history of psychology classes, intro to psychology classes, but it's not a really strong field. This was one of the originals, and we jumped off from here, and he brought popularity and notoriety to psychology, and that's why we learn about it. But it's not, it doesn't have a whole lot of substance to it today after empirical testing and research and whatnot. So everything that you hear about this Freud part, it's not, right? This is, everybody's heard of Freud before. This isn't stuff that's today really accepted as reality. It's just stuff that we need to learn about the history and kind of how psychology got its start. All right, so Freud had three basic parts to your unconscious. Each person has three basic things. You have the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is basically your unconscious, and it operates on this thing called the pleasure principle, right? It wants to please you. So the id is all about pleasing you, okay? It wants to please you. The ego works on this idea called the reality principle, and it wants to, it's living in the real moment. What's acceptable? What's unacceptable? What can I get away with? What can't I? And the superego is like your conscience. I can't spell it. So conscience. So the superego is your conscience. Is you've got the devil on your shoulder and the angel on your shoulder, like on The Simpsons. You're talking to Bart, and you got Devil Bart and Angel Bart. Well, Devil Bart's like the id, is telling him what Bart should do to feel good, to have fun. The Angel Bart's like, no, you shouldn't do this. This is wrong. And the ego is kind of your decision making in the middle, kind of deciding, okay, which weighing the goods and the bads and operating in reality. What should I do? This should I not do that? And how am I going to operate? It's kind of been presented as an iceberg, right? And so what he says is this, is that your unconscious is huge, right? It's this huge reservoir, and an iceberg, right? What you see of the iceberg is just a tiny percentage of what the actual iceberg is. Underneath is a ton of stuff. So underneath this unconscious that you don't actually see is this huge amount. That's your id. So you have all these unconscious desires and motives. The superego is somewhat unconscious, subconscious. It goes into both. And then your ego, a little bit, barely over. So, the smallest part is your ego. Your superego's got some conscious. Your id's huge. and then you're operating in this area right here. Okay. So Freud came up with these psychosexual stages. He says, kind of like, remember Erikson? Erik Erikson had these psychosocial stages of development. Well, Freud had these psychosexual stages of development. Remember Freud, everything was sexual. Everything, all your motives were revolved around sexual desires. And so he had 5 stages. So the first stage was oral, and that occurred between 0 and 18 months. Remember, in all these stages, just like Erikson, you had to fulfill the conflict that was going on in this stage, or else you would be fixated on it. Fixated is when you don't resolve a conflict in a particular stage, and then you get stuck on it for the rest of your life. Basically, you're constantly kind of stuck on that. And so he would say people with mental problems a lot of times were fixating on an earlier stage that wasn't satisfied. So oral stage, this is where you want to stick everything in your mouth, right? Kids are breastfeeding. You watch a little kid. My son, 8 months old, he takes everything he finds and sticks it in his mouth, right? So he would say, he sees, Freud saw that, he says, well, all these kids must have this fascination with oral. The second stage is the anal stage. And this is where kids get their pleasure from their bowels and their bladder, and the conflict is kind of trying to control their body, right? Because you're pooping your pants, you're not able to go to the bathroom on your own, but so it's this conflict of control. By the time you're about 3 years old, you're starting to gain some control over that, right? And so he's saying if you don't reach this conflict, you're going to be fixated on it, and you're going to have problems. I don't know what the problems necessarily are going to be, but there could be problems. Next would come phallic. This is where and this is from basically 3 to 6. Your pleasure zone is your genitals, but these aren't like super sexual feelings like you would have as an adult. Latency is from 6 to puberty, and this is where sexual feelings are starting to dominate. They're just starting to come out. And then finally, the last stage is the genital, and this is puberty on. And this is the maturation of sexual desires. So he says you have these 5 stages. If you get caught up in any one of these stages, you're going to have problems, okay? He also has this interesting concept called the Oedipus complex. And he says basically, the boys are in love with their mothers as a young children. And the Oedipus complex is that you have this dislike and even hate for your father because your father has your mom and you don't, and as a boy, as a young boy. And so you have to develop this Oedipus complex in which you dislike or hate your father. There's also the reverse for women. It's called the Electra complex. But it's kind of this interesting idea here that Freud came up with. All right, moving on. So he says, okay, so you have these different things that go on unconsciously, and your body's constantly trying to, keep itself protected, and so it has these defense mechanisms, and it's your ego's way, right? Remember, the ego is what you're able to concentrate on. You're able to understand. It's your ego's way of protecting itself, and so it basically distorts reality so that it can protect itself. And so defense mechanisms, there's these 5 ways that Freud's kind of come up with, and these protect yourself. So repression is when you take an idea, it's exactly like it sounds, and you repress it. Sorry about that. So repression, you repress, you take it from your conscious and you put it in your unconscious. So you take an idea or an event or a memory that you don't want to remember, you put it in your unconscious so you don't have to deal with it. So that would be repression. Regression is where you go back to an earlier stage of development. So you regress backwards because you're able to deal with life or the situation more easily in that regard. Reaction formation is kind of interesting. This is where you take a feeling and you do the exact opposite. So remember the Oedipus complex, I hate my dad, becomes I love my dad. So you react by doing the opposite. So instead of hating it, you can't deal with that. That's not gonna work in your family. So you turn it around and becomes I love my dad, right? Some kind of interesting, weird type ideas when you think about it today. Rationalization is exactly like it sounds. We distort reality, and instead of I'm an alcoholic, I only drink because I'm drinking socially. I'm drinking because there's other people around, and it would be not cool of me to not drink, so I'm drinking socially. So I rationalize my behavior that way. or everybody's doing it. So that's another form of rationalization. And then finally, displacement is where you take kind of an unacceptable feeling or action and you displace it onto something else. So for instance, if you're really ticked off at your parents, instead of getting really ticked off at your parents, which you know will get you into a lot of trouble, you're going to get really ticked off at your dog or your little brother or sister or something, and you're displacing that anger at something else. Okay. Um, so those are defense mechanisms that your ego uses to kind of everything has underlying is suppression, right? You're suppressing these feelings, and it's defensive protecting yourself so you don't have to deal with it. Okay, finally, today we're going to talk about the Neo-Freudians. These are new Freudians. So Neo-Freudians are some people who were kind of disciples of Freud or came right after Freud. And they kind of liked his ideas. They believed necessarily in this unconscious thing or a lot of his things, but they didn't take everything. And so most of these Neo-Freudians differed from Freud in two important ways. They said that the conscious played a more important role than Freud said. Freud basically said your unconscious is driving everything. And they also basically said that sex isn't the only motive that you have, okay? So we'll start down here actually with Carl Jung. Carl Jung was actually a contemporary of Freud, was a friend of Freud, and actually later on in his life started to distance himself and basically didn't do a lot of the same stuff as Freud did. But he believed in this idea called this collective unconscious, which says he kind of actually did think that the unconscious played a big role. But he says it wasn't sexual desires. He says we have these collective unconscious that has these common memory traces or these common memories that all species share. And so we all share these certain things, and that's what helps us act. So it's a little bit, of an evolutionary perspective. Oops, stop. Evolutionary perspective in that regard. So for instance, an example of this is everybody in every culture has the same idea of what a hero is. We all know what a hero is. We all know what a hero does. We have to have these stories. And when we hear of a hero, we have this idea of what it is. And Jung would say, this is an example of this collective unconscious that we all share. Okay, another Neo-Freudian would be Alfred Adler. Adler said, it's not these sexual desires, but it's social, these social conflicts inside. So a lot like Erickson, we have these social conflicts, unconsciously, not sexual. And he's actually the guy who came up with the idea of, you've probably heard this before, inferiority complex, right? And so inferior as a social situation, right? You feel inferior to your peers or someone, and so he came up with this idea called inferiority complex. And then there's Karen Horney. She said that one of the things that Freud said is that all women have this thing called penis envy, right? Because they don't have a penis. She says, no, that's a bunch of rubbish. Freud also says women have weak superegos, weak conscience. And she said, again, this is dumb. I showed some research on that. She developed this idea called neurosis. Neurosis is a strong desire or need. That desire, that's when you get into problems. And so if you satisfy those needs, then you're going to live a happy life and everything's going to go well. But when you stop satisfying those needs, that's when there's problems. So there's some three kind of Neo-Freudians that you should really know: Adler, Horney, and Jung. All right, so those are the three. Collective unconscious is Carl Jung's big thing. Horney's kind of neurosis. This is one of the first women Neo-Freudians. And then there's Adler, who was more social conflicts and didn't think that sex had everything to do with it. All right, that's it for Freud and whatnot, and we'll get to different types of personality perspectives in the next